Hello everyone and welcome back to Closet Gaming. Today we're going to take a look at a Hypergun. This roguelite first-person shooter promises good procedural generation of not only the environments, but also of the weapons in a good-looking package. Whether it can deliver on this promise is the question we will try to answer today. Hypergun is available on Steam for €12.49, your regional equivalent. First-person shooter roguelite games are still somewhat of a rarity, and I find that very sad, as I think they could be one of the most successful genres with a very wide mass appeal, especially for casual gamers. So let's take a look at one that tries to cater exactly to that sort of crowd. And as we do always, we will begin the review by looking at the very core mechanics of Hypergun. And at its core, it is a very simple wave-based first-person shooter survival game. Something we have seen in the gaming industry many times over. But it takes the procedural generation aspect of many roguelike games and just attaches that as a cherry on top. And not only it uses procedural generation for the creation of rooms and enemy waves, it also tries something new. Procedural generation of the weapons themselves. So, what exactly do you have at your disposal to use against the many waves of enemies? Obviously, you got your weapon that you're able to shoot, but the weapon is something we will discuss in more detail a bit later on in the review. And apart from the weapon, you got a few other tools to defeat your enemies. You got your secondary weapons, which visually work like attachments to a weapon, but mechanically are just separate weapons. And then you have your class-specific abilities, which range from the stuff you would expect, like an increase to your speed, faster fire rate, or more interesting abilities, like a temporary cloak that also summons a clone so you can easily escape from danger. The class abilities are actually rather cool, and give a lot of variability in how you approach the game. Though if you prefer one class over another because of the weapon it uses, you can also change abilities that you can unlock, giving you the option to easily customize your character to exactly suit your preferences. The secondary weapons are something I still like, but I like them much less than their class abilities. That is for a very simple reason. You don't have access to them from the very start, or sometimes at all. As they are treated as attachments to your primary weapon, you have to be lucky enough to get one as a drop. And the thing is, when you have access to them, the game got about 30% easier just because of that. And relying on blind luck to get a secondary weapon that dramatically decreases the game's difficulty is not something I find particularly fun. It could have been easily removed by treating them as a completely separate entity from the other weapon attachments and selling them in the in-game shop, which is not for real money. I just thought I'd stress that out. So you would always have an easy route to get access to them. And lastly, the primary weapon itself. And here I sadly have to report I'm utterly disappointed. They market the procedural generation of weapons as one of their core mechanics. And while it is there, it works very differently from what you would expect. When I hear procedural generation, I imagine that you will get a very different experience in every single playthrough. But that's just not the case here. Instead of getting completely different weapons, you get these attachments that change the behavior of the weapons very slightly. Like 5% extra damage here and 10% fire rate there. But that doesn't change how the weapon fundamentally works. And I think this is a huge missed opportunity. Okay, that's it for the tools at your disposal. But what exactly will be thrown at you to defeat? A decent variety of enemies and bosses actually. The enemies do have a few issues though. Even though there is a good number of them, they do feel like they're just being repeated a bit too often. And the reasons why this is fairly obvious. As you progress further through the game, more and more enemy types will appear. But in a roguelike game, you often just die and have to start from the beginning. And every time you do that, you will encounter the same exact enemies, only getting to see the cooler ones once you progress further into the levels. And even there, you still get to see the ones from the first level. Even just adding some sort of elemental class to these basic enemies as you get further into the game could definitely change that feeling, but it's sadly just not there. The bosses, on the other hand, are quite fun for the first few attempts. The bosses are each unique, come with the need to have a strategy to defeat them, and actually introduce that adrenaline rush we all seek when playing first-person shooters. But the problem is, you always encounter the same bosses at the same levels. I'd prefer if there was like a library of bosses that randomly spawn and just have their stats adjusted to accommodate for in what level you are. That would make them feel much better. And lastly, we also have to talk about the non-combat rooms, of which there are 3 types. The first one is just a treasure chest that will sometimes require a key to open. But if you have a key, or it's just a chest you can open without a key, it will always contain some sort of weapon attachment. Secondly, there is the in-game shop, where you can buy health packs, shields, and similar stuff for credits, which are called bits, that you can find when you're playing. And lastly, there is a room that contains a map of the level. I know, boring. So now the question is this: is Hypergun fun to play? Yes and no. It is fun in short bursts. The problem is it doesn't have a save feature where you could finish a level, quit the game, and return to the place where you have ended. So you're forced to either sit down for about 2 to 3 hours to finish a run, or just play the first few levels. And that's where the problem lies. Hypergun is not that fun to play in large doses, and if you only play the first few levels over and over again, it quickly becomes very repetitive. And it could have all been solved by a simple dialogue that asks you whether you want to save your game and quit after you complete a level, but it's just missing. Okay, that's pretty much all I have to say about the gameplay. Let's now take a look at the more superficial aspects of Hypergun, starting with its graphics. And to be honest, the graphics are fairly nice. Obviously, this isn't a game that will just blow you away with its graphics, but considering the game has been built with Unity, and the price for which is available, it looks fair. Though there is one problem with the graphical design, and that is the fact that rooms in each level look exactly the same. Yes, once you get to another level, stuff changes, but not by very much either. More graphical variability throughout the levels is desperately needed. Story-wise, there really isn't much to talk about. You're working in a company designing the ultimate weapon to defend the world from an alien invasion, and you're doing so in a simulation. But luckily, the story really isn't important in this genre. Then there is the music and sound design, which is, well, the music is good. Actually pretty nice. Sadly, the best music is in the lobby, and goes away when you enter the levels. But even the music that fulfills the role very nicely. On the other hand, the sound design leaves a lot to be desired. In these games, sound design should be helpful and allow you to orient yourself in the heat of the battle. But here it doesn't accomplish that goal, as enemies are essentially silent until they're on top of you and can't attack you. Sadly, that takes a lot of the immersion away, especially since many of the monsters are huge hulking monstrosities that walks more silently than a ballerina. And lastly, there's the performance, and there again are a few problems. The game tends to freeze up for a few seconds almost every time you first started and you enter into a level. And I did encounter a situation where I got stuck in a place and I couldn't move at all a few times. And this is super irritating, especially if you happen to be in the middle of a run when you finally have a great weapon. At least I never had the game crash on me. So, in conclusion, Hypergun is not a game I can truly recommend. It came with an interesting premise, but it failed to deliver on it. Seriously, the idea of having a completely different weapon every time you play and adjusting your game plan to it sounds great. But because the weapons change almost exclusively in minuscule ways, it feels like you're using the same weapon all the time. Add to that the fact that the game is highly repetitive and it doesn't manage to make that a fun thing, and even more on top of that, the fact that it has some performance issues, I would just be wrong to recommend this. That being said, it's not completely bad. If it ever goes under $5 in price and you're just looking for something to shoot stuff in, it isn't the worst choice you could make. But it isn't the best either. If you truly want a good roguelite FPS, check out Ziggurat or Immortal Redneck, which will you have more fun in. So that's it for today, guys. Hope you liked the review, and if you did, please consider giving us a thumbs up here on YouTube and subscribe to the channel. And comment if you had something you would like to add. See you guys later with more gaming content.